I'm Alana,
And I'm Jessie.
and we are making mentions. Welcome to the first episode of our four-part series on anti-Semitism broadly. Tonight, we're going to talk about defining anti-Semitism and breaking down anti-Semitic tropes. The other three episodes talk about grappling with anti-Semitism from celebrities and from our peers, Jewish generational trauma, both related to and beyond the Holocaust, and then finally processing anti-Semitism as Jews and dealing with internalized anti-Semitism. So we wanted to do this series just in light of a recent surge in anti-Semitism and the consequential conversations that have been stemming from that anti-Semitism in the media and amongst peers and loved ones. And I think for us, it was important to have a conversation about anti-Semitism that stood outside of conversations around anti-Zionism. And I think it was important for us to have a conversation as anti-Zionists about anti-Semitism, because I think a lot of the time in mainstream media, a response to anti-Semitic attacks is to go super staunchly Zionist and very pro-Israel and supportive of genocide. So I think we just wanted to counter that and have a conversation for fellow anti-Zionist Jews and our peers who are not Jewish.
Yeah, I love that. And that was so beautifully said. Just a perfect capsule of all the things we're going to be talking about. And I think we're interrupting some of that generational trauma that we'll be speaking about later by creating space to discuss anti-Semitism without repeating the trauma and enacting it on other people. So that's what this space is right now.
Yes, and I'm excited. Let's just jump in with
Yeah.
simply what is anti-Semitism. I guess before we even get to that, talking about the hyphen in
Yeah.
anti-Semitism, which I think was kind of new knowledge for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
I know I saw this from Jew Witches, so shout out to Jew Witches on Instagram. But I think a lot of times I see the word anti-Semitism and I sort of thought anti-Semitism and then anti-Semitism hyphenated were interchangeable, and it was sort of personal preference, like Hanukkah and how you decide to spell Hanukkah. But the hyphen doesn't actually make sense in the word. So just framing it from that point of view, grammatical point of view, it is just anti-Semitism without the hyphen. I'm going to talk about it quoting from Jewish's post where she talks about how Jews are not a race. It is a ethno-religious group at at best, lots of conversation to be had around that. But Jews are not a race. So the idea that there would be a Semitic people doesn't make sense because that's based on racial ideology. And so when we remove the hyphen,
Yeah, as a temporary solution,
yes, okay.
because yeah, I was reading that as well. To eliminate the confusion that there is anything about Jews that makes us a race. And because we have not evolved as a society yet to the point where we can have a nuanced conversation about anti-Semitism versus anti-Semitism, I think my understanding is that to debunk all that kind of Nazi race science bullshit, we're just removing the hyphen to make it easier for everyone.
There we go.
Right?
Thank you. I needed that summation as well because I was reading it and I was like, this makes sense to me. How do I reframe this out loud?
Same. Same.
So I think just even starting there, in that there is not a race of Jewish people. Jews are an ethno-religious group, and there are Jews from all different racial backgrounds. And yeah, the idea of categorizing Jews as a race is based in a lot of Nazi rhetoric around anti-Semitism. And so what is anti-Semitism?
There are a lot of different sources for defining anti-Semitism online. We are basing a lot of our understanding of the definition of anti-Semitism in Jews for Racial and Economic Justice's Understanding Anti-Semitism publication. And they very succinctly, I'm going to quote them, describe anti-Semitism as the form of ideological oppression that targets Jews. And it states very clearly that it originated in European Christianity and currently functions and functioned in the past to protect the prevailing economic system and almost exclusively Christian ruling class by diverting blame for hardship onto Jews. And I really like the way that is set up because it's not, as I was taught, hating Jews or disliking Jews. It's so much more expansive than that because it's systemic and it's based in these really old ideologies from Europe, and it is so much more baked into our culture than just not liking Jews, as it was kind of described to me, I think, when I was a child. So that's the definition we will be using moving forward.
Yeah, and I think what you included from the same source that was really interesting and I think important for us to acknowledge is that even though anti Semitism was originally grounded by this Christian hegemony, and that still surrounds anti Semitism, and anti Semitism is shrouded in that, like, Christian hegemony. They say that anti Semitism has become an ideology of its own, drawing from plenty of other ideological backgrounds, and that they say in order to analyze and effectively combat anti Semitism, it's important to distinguish between the various types of anti Semitism. And I think that's important because we're going to touch on this later today, but there are definitely forms of anti Semitism that I think it's easier to push back against because it's grounded in that Christianity. And then there are forms of anti Semitism that sort of ground themselves in a lot of racial dynamics that can make it very uncomfortable to push back against without the proper insight and knowledge.
I think some of these are so old too. It's so interesting to see where it stems from rather than thinking this feels anti-Semitic. No, there's an ideology that perpetrated that versus some things that we can analyze more modern reasons and context for it being anti-Semitic, but some of these are so old that it's really good to know where they came from and why they are anti-Semitic.
Yeah, so let's just get into some of the tropes. I think we wanted to go through tropes because, like in any form of oppression, there are usually these like tropes or phrases or images or ideas that people sometimes might be ignorant to the meaning behind them. I'm thinking even something like phrases like the peanut gallery being colloquial language, but with further research, that being grounded in a lot of racism. And so we want to break down some of these tropes so that it's easier to recognize anti Semitism in places that it might not have been clear to folks before, and for Jews who might know some of these tropes just to get a deeper understanding of where they're coming from. So the first one, I was going to say the most popular, but I don't know if that's how I want to start talking about anti-Semitic tropes. And I actually don't even know if this is the most popular. I feel like the power, Jews having a lot of power, is the going one right now. But the first one that we want to talk about is the idea of blood libel.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty standard trope when it comes to anti-Semitism. It's basically, the best way to summarize it is this idea that Jewish people use the blood of non-Jewish people, especially Christians and especially children, for religious rituals. This is not true. This is not true, but this is a false claim that has been made to demonize Jews that actually stems back to as early as that we can see 1144. And we see it as recently as this year all around us. There's a lot of examples of blood libel coming up with QAnon and the whole conspiracy theory of QAnon. And so that is the summation of blood libel. And it's been used throughout history in a lot of different ways. There are ideas that Jews would celebrate communion on Easter Sunday by drinking the blood of Christian children. A lot of it is based in Christianity. This is definitely one of those ones that's grounded in Christianity, and I think has, in its newer iterations of QAnon, sort of grown out of that. And it also has this idea of the cabal as part of it, which extends into some of these other tropes, which is that there's a secret group of very powerful, in this case, like Jewish people, maybe rabbis, elders, that are taking part in these blood rituals. We see it now with QAnon that global elites are basically trafficking children in order to harvest their blood. And so that's sort of new age version of, yeah, the blood libel trope and conspiracy.
This one unexpectedly for me as a horror movie fan, I had a whole new lens on this, thinking about vampires and some horror movies I watched that are really good about snatching children and witches using their blood to stay young, and all these tropes that I had not connected as anti-Semitic, but looking back on now, they don't come from nowhere, and we know that Jews have been accused of being witches or poisoning wells or all of these other stereotypes that have come from fear and mistrust of Jews. And just reflecting on having had Halloween a few weeks ago, I don't know, it hit me in a new way this time reading through all the blood libel stuff again. So I'm going to see if we can include some sources on the anti-Semitism of monsters in horror movies and blood libel. But yeah, it just struck me more this time reading about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I think that just speaks to how, in so many of these situations, anti Semitism is so covert. And because these tropes are so historic and in some ways have grown to be kind of subtle, things that we normally wouldn't assume to be anti-Semitic are actually grounded in anti-Semitism. I definitely read a source somewhere that was talking about how the evil figure in a lot of horror films in general usually has a lot of the physical features that have been used to stereotype Jews, like a really large nose or the rubbing of the hands together. And that's actually like a very popular anti-Semitic meme that has grown out of anti-Semitic imagery that's very old at this point. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it's hard even to pick up on as Jewish people. And so for people who are not Jewish who are trying to identify anti-Semitism, yeah, I think it's really important to be educated on what to look for. In our sources, I have a brief history of blood libel that stems it back to its origin. And I just want to touch on the origin. William of Norwich died, and then it was blamed on the Jewish community of Norwich. And the Jewish community was basically accused of using William of Norwich for a blood ritual and murdering him. And in consequential centuries, there have been plenty of depictions of blood libel, plenty of media controversy around blood libel or suggesting blood libel. And yeah, we see it even moving in towards the present day with QAnon as well.
Sometimes the QAnon memes I have not kept up with, and I'm shocked to see them and realize that I'm probably 6 degrees of separation away from somebody who's sharing blood libel memes on Facebook somehow. So it's terrifying, but they are always getting more inventive with them.
So if you see someone sharing something about how Jews or quote unquote powerful people are using the blood of anyone for religious ritual or ritual in general, that is probably grounded in the anti-Semitic trope of blood libel. I feel like that leads into the trope of power, which is so expansive and complex. I feel like it's really nailed down. But do you want to speak to the Elders of Zion?
Yeah. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is propaganda, completely fake, fabricated, absolutely not based in any real source at all. Important to say. It was Russian propaganda distributed in like 1903, I think is the date that's sticking in my mind, and was used throughout the rest of the West for, I mean, still making its ways around the internet now. The premise is that it is somehow these secretive notes from a Jewish meeting held in Switzerland where Jews were plotting to take over the Christian world and to overthrow the social order. And it was highly effective in condemning the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but made its way all the way to our very own Henry Ford here in America, who reprinted it and distributed it to everybody he knew because he believed that Jews were trying to take over the world. And in this document, we get some of the associations with the Jews being not trustworthy in the sense of them being international, cosmopolitan, globalist, all these terms to imply that Jews can't be trusted and are waiting amongst all of us to overthrow the social order. Jews have a lot of money, top level access to all of these government institutions, and that we as Jews are somehow just waiting for the right moment to betray everybody that we are close to and rise up against the system. Also, it reinforces the stereotype that you can't always recognize a Jew lying in wait to overthrow the world, and they could be amongst you at any moment and then turn on you. Again, that we are untrustworthy, dirty, foreign, and that somehow we have this corrupting influence on the good, regular people, and we're going to incite trouble and basically cause the end of the world. So it was highly effective in convincing people, and we see this tropes today, but this is the way that it developed from the protocols.
Thanks, Jesse. I feel like this is the one that is so far-reaching and has really been rearing its head recently. We can see in connection to the Protocols of Zion this idea of a new world order that's been talked about a lot in these recent conversations, anti-Semitic conversations. And again, this is a conspiracy that there's a small group of really powerful individuals that are working to establish global control, and is obviously anti-Semitic when referring to Jewish individuals, but also like it's very much called to the Protocols of Zion. And in a lot of ways, I don't know, I would suggest anytime someone is talking about New World Order or it's abbreviated to NWO, it's going to be grounded in anti-Semitism. I think there are a ton of memes that we see that are grounded in this idea. I'm gonna flip my camera around and show, yeah, getting innovative here. Well, if you're listening to the podcast, you're gonna have to look this one up. But the first meme that I'm gonna show is the Happy Merchant memes. This will be in our sources, but look up the Happy Merchant meme. This is the Happy Merchant meme. Sorry to the Jews who have to see this. So yeah, this is basically just a typical character based on Jewish stereotypes. It's a person rubbing their hands together, referencing a pot of control or greed. And they have this hooked nose that is very typically used to stereotype Jewish people, and have sort of a smirk in the eyes. And obviously also in this photo, this man wearing a yarmulke as well. So again, this is used in a lot of different contexts just to indicate power hungry or greedy Jews. And I think this idea of the greedy or money hungry Jew is also very connected to this idea of the Jew who wants control over everything. I think those tropes sort of go hand in hand. There's also, this is the octopus imagery. So just look up anti-Semitic octopus memes, but this is an example of the meme. The imagery is used in a lot of different ways, but anything where there's an octopus wrapping itself around something, this is again, anti-Semitic imagery. Basically, it's supposed to indicate Jewish control, like wrapping and constricting. And so, even if you see a Jewish individual just depicted as an octopus, that's a call to this specific meme and this imagery, referencing again this trope of power hungry, control hungry, greedy Jews. This is also seen, this is the final one I'll show, and you can look this up by looking at puppeteer anti-Semitic meme. This one depicts George Soros because a lot of these memes and ideas also talk about George Soros, and I'll wrap around to that. But again, this is just depicting this Jewish control, or Jewish individuals basically controlling politicians or powerful individuals with this end goal of world domination and control. And so the memes look similar to that, had the idea of this puppeteering going on. The one that I showed has George Soros as the puppeteer, and George Soros is commonly referenced during these anti-Semitic stereotypes around power, control, greed. A lot of conservative-leaning folks accuse George Soros of appearing in US and global politics, and because he's Jewish and wealthy and liberal, just had coalesced in him being the figurehead of this Jewish domination and greed. So those are just a few examples, but I think, again, like, we see bits and pieces of them constantly when this trope of power hungry or control hungry Jews comes up. And I think it also really ties into this idea of money hungry being a Jewish stereotype, which we don't even have a specific conversation on in this. I feel like that should hopefully be obvious to most people. Although I don't really think that it is. And there is this sort of common misconception that all Jews are wealthy and greedy and have access to money, and like the phrase, oh, like that person Jewed me or something, or they're Jewing me, which like someone said to me recently, and I was like definitely can't say that. And they were like, oh, like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. And I was like, but
What? Oh my God.
so yeah, that is again just grounded in these same ideas around Jews seeking world domination. Again, none of this is true. There is, and I realized this was false, but there is this narrative that goes around that Jews were only able to hold certain money lending positions, and that's actually false. But that used to be like, this is where that trope comes from. It's not. I think it is much more just connected to this idea of like Jews being sneaky and power hungry.
Which, whenever we get into our personal experiences, we could talk a lot about how that shows up today. But yeah, I was just thinking too, even the TikTok nose thing that happened, where this filter to show your own face, but with a very dramatic hooked nose, to make you, I guess, grateful for the shape of your nose not looking like that is what people were using it for. But that even, comes from some of these images that Alana's sharing, because how else do you know that this is what ugly looks like than if you see it in a picture as a Jew? So yeah, thank you for showing those images. I think it's important to see how it shows up in other images today.
One of the final ones we're going to talk about today that is also just historical and continues to show up in recent times is this trope of Jews as being like dirty or diseased. Again, we have sources on all of this. What I will say on some of the sources is I think it's really hard to get good information from sources that are anti-Zionist. A lot of these sources, I cannot speak to their politics, but they provided good historical information on these tropes. Obviously, we are coming at this from an anti-Zionist lens, but we can take information from a source without validating their political and moral leanings. So just caveating with that. But basically, dirt and disease Jews have long been depicted as like animals in a very specific anti-Semitic way. So like we talked about the Jew as Then octopus, talking about global control, but other ones are Jews being depicted as lowly creatures or dirty creatures like rats, which, first of all, I love a rat, so I hate the idea that that's dirty and lowly. Or spiders, other animals that have these negative, dirty connotations. And so the idea is that associating or portraying Jews as these dirty and lowly animals makes people view Jews as less than human or subhuman or dirty. And in the case of a lot of these animals, as vermin or spreaders of plague and disease. And so, because again, this idea is because they're vermin and spreaders of disease, they must be eradicated. Also, the depiction of Jews as pigs. Again, all of these are stereotypically dirty, disease spreading creatures. And so that connects to Jews being blamed for a variety of plagues stemming back to the bubonic plague. And most recently, actually, COVID. There are a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories around COVID being a Jewish conspiracy for a multitude of reasons. Again, none of this really seems to make sense in my brain, but it's making sense to enough people that people hate Jews, so I guess that's what matters here. But we have a really good source on the connection between Jews being dirty and COVID-19. So if you're interested in that, you can read more into it there. And yeah, generally all of this imagery of Jews, whether it be as animals or dirty creatures, or as having large noses or really bulbous features, this is all a vehicle used to make people feel like disgust and repulsion towards Jews. And it combines really well with these tropes of money, power, conspiracy, blood. These are all things that are intentional in order to make people feel disgust and dislike and distrust of Jewish people. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that one?
No, I think that was really well said. I was just thinking of spiders and rats and pigs and yeah, the disgust, and also that they're like spiders and rats are really hard to get rid of and really
Mm-hmm.
sneaky and slippery and always find a way to survive no matter what, and how all of that I like the term zoomorphism. I wouldn't have thought of that term, but I see it in our sources. And anytime someone is being zoomorphized, anytime you see a group of people being portrayed as animals or rats or vermin, is probably a good indication that you're looking at some oppressive and probably problematic imagery.
Yeah, definitely. And like again, all those words like sneaky or slippery and sly and impossible to like or really hard to eradicate, those are all concepts that are anti-Semitic and used to talk about Jews. Some tropes that we didn't touch on are these ideas of Jews being Christ killers and the people who murdered Jesus Christ, also just generally Jews as demonic. I think a lot of those should be hopefully a bit self explanatory, but if you are more curious about them, there is a wealth of knowledge on the internet. But yeah, this idea that Jews killed Jesus is super anti Semitic and not grounded in any truth. The thing that we wanted to end on today is something that has come up in a lot of the recent anti Semitism that we've seen in the media from Kanye and Kyrie Irving. And it is talking about Hebrew Israelites. If you're someone who lives in New York City or a city, I can only speak to New York City, there are a lot of groups of Hebrew Israelites who are often preaching on the street. And there is, yeah, I think it's very complicated for us to talk about as two white people because Hebrew Israelites are the full title, I guess, would be Black Hebrew Israelites. This is the idea that Black people are the true Semitic people, quote unquote, and that Jewish people have taken their birthright, so to speak. Hebrew Israelites are actually identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group because at its core that is what it is, but a lot of the language I think has been brought into the mainstream and normalized and taken out of its anti-Semitic context. And I also think it's just, again, I mentioned a few moments ago, it's really difficult to have conversations around how anti-Semitic Hebrew Israelite rhetoric is without getting into a conversation about race. And so there's a lot that I don't know that I feel super comfortable speaking on. And I also think that's why it's so difficult to have conversations around this topic because so much of it devolves into race. But what I do have a few sources in our sources for the week if you're interested in reading more about that. Other people who have, publicized Hebrew Israelite ideology or Nick Cannon. A lot of it also starts to talk about how Jews control the media, which again, this is another very popular anti-Semitic trope around Jewish control is that Jews control the media and Jews control Hollywood. Yeah, that is grounded in anti-Semitism, and I think what is really important to note is that Jews can be from all racial backgrounds, and Jewish people have existed for centuries and centuries, and they have always been from all different races. And again, Judaism is not a race, it's a religion and in some ways an ethnic group. And so, yeah, I think that's the core of where already this ideology doesn't make a lot of sense because Jewish people can also be Black, and there are plenty of Black Jews. Do you want to add anything to that?
I was just gonna say we can include some Black Jews voices who have spoken out about this issue in particular recently. And I think the reason we wanted to highlight this at the end is because sometimes Black Hebrew Israelite content gets the most focus in our society as being the only anti-Semitic thing that is happening right now, where in
Mm-hmm.
actuality we've had a huge uptick in anti-Semitic language from white supremacists across the nation and across the globe that has been largely ignored. I think because we uh, let white people get away with a lot of shit that has been going on for centuries, and instead the media sometimes sensationalizes things that Black people say and share, and Black celebrities. And so we wanted to root this conversation in anti-Semitic tropes that are literally 500 years old plus, because that's most likely where a lot of the anti-Semitic things you're hearing have come from. And also, there can be trending news stories about anti-Semitism that come from a different place. So I think it's really important to have context and to have a wider scope when we're talking about anti-Semitism. But yeah, everything you just said, I think, really well said.
Yeah, and just highlighting that anti-Semitism, like most other forms of oppression, is coming from a place of white supremacy, and pushing forward these narratives only feeds into white supremacy. Anyone who is oppressed by white supremacy and white nationalism, the goal is to work together. The whole point of white supremacy is that encourages the it encourages conflict between oppressed groups when the reality of the situation is all oppressed groups will be able to work towards liberation much hopefully faster if we're all working together towards like our collective liberation. So yeah, just highlighting that anti-Semitism is a form of white supremacy and usually is coming from white supremacists and white Christians, but like Jesse said, the tropes have permeated society and can end up showing up in other ways as well. I think that's where we'll wrap it up today. I mean, I think that people have written books on anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes, so there's no way we could really touch on everything in one session, but we would just wanted to ground the series here, just talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes. And then in our next session in 2 Wednesdays at 8 p.m., we're going to talk about grappling with anti-Semitism from celebrities and peers. We sort of touched on the uptick in anti-Semitism today, but we'll get way more into those conversations and what people have said recently
Okay.
in that episode on November 30th. Is there anything else we should point people towards, Jesse?
I don't think so, other than read all our sources and our newsletter, and make sure you're signed up for our newsletter because it has all the sources and you don't have to go looking for it on Instagram.
Yeah, exactly. Sign up for our newsletter. Our sources will be in there. There's also a link in our bio to our sources sheet, though, if you don't want to get our newsletter. And shout out to Nate for our podcast music, which is wonderful and incredible. Yeah, we'll see you on the 30th.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.